Or excuse me. Wow. Wow.
No camera. Welcome everyone, and now we have a completely different video for you. Today that is me and my very esteemed hot guest that I have invited on this show especially, we are going to be discussing something of the utmost importance. We are going to go through and talk about our favorite comics and graphic novels of all time. That is, I mean, trade paperbacks and stuff like that, and giving you our recommendations. And this is to prove to all of you who try to accuse me of not reading comics. I have, in fact, read my comics. So now we are going to get started. But first, I want to introduce this guest, Kelly. Okay, Kelly. And now, Kelly, I have been trying
I'm
to.
definitely not related to you.
Yes, she's not related to me.
We have no relation.
She's a homeless lady who lives on the homeless street.
She just picked me up off the
And
street once
yeah,
again.
I just picked this lady off the street when I needed a guest. Anyway, I have been trying to corrupt you for years to get you to read stories in the comic format, and I have been woefully unsuccessful with all of my attempts. But finally, it seems like you had a way into finally reading a lot of comics this year. And what franchise was your way into reading comics or franchises?
Well, it was definitely Marvel, and actually the first comic I ever read, if we're actually going way back, it was in the 90s, and I read a comic called Captain Commission, and it was supposed to be kind of a Christian spin of Superman, but he was, you know, proclaiming the gospel and the Great Commission and all this stuff. So that was the first comic I ever read, and it wasn't that great. And then there was a couple other like comic booky things. Again, this was very much like Christian comic books, like uh child falls
Hole.
yeah,
I remember that comic.
yeah, those comics creep me out. Or like two people fall in, their car goes off the ledge into over the bridge into the lake, and have to be rescued and break out of the car. And so those were the kind of comics I read growing up, and that's probably one of the reasons I didn't really like them because they were just they were a niche. But then as an adult, and this is with much poking and prodding on Teresa's part to get me to start reading comics, because I very much have always been a reader of prose,
Prose.
prose. Um, Mostly because again, very young, started reading things like Little House on the Prairie and stuff like that, and there's no pictures. And that's mostly what I read is no pictures, because I have a much better imagination than any artist, and I have a much scarier imagination than any artist, and everything is a lot scarier when I read it without pictures or when I read it versus watching a movie. So I was always very hesitant and reticent to reading comics. But the very first real, honest to goodness Marvel comic that I ever read, and I read Marvel before DC. And most of my top comics that we're going to talk about today are actually, I think they're all Marvel at this point. But I haven't read a lot of DC. I've only really read Batman ones. But the first comic I ever read was the original Civil War comic, and Teresa can explain. This is a trade.
That's a trade paperback version of it, and yeah, Civil War. And what do you like about this comic? What drew you to it?
First of all, it's because it was actually a complete story, and if you read a lot of single issue comics, they are just bits and pieces of a larger story, and so those, I think, are much less accessible to the average person.
Which is why I just like to interject why I think it's so hard to get people into reading comics, because it's like you have to, because they were done for the format of people are going to come into the market every week and pick this up for $1 off the stand and to read the next part of the story. And so it's really hard to collect all of that. And there would be so many crossovers. It's hard to collect all of that together and in a cohesive story.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed this, because it had all the stories wrapped up into one and just drew me in, and actually had more, interesting elements to it than just superhero back and forth. It was the first time that it had really introduced an emotional element to it. The whole, obviously Spider-Man having to come out and reveal his secret identity was a big moment, but I didn't realize like the Fantastic Four are in the original Civil War comic. And I'm going to spoil some things. I think we should just tell the audience right now, there's going to be spoilers here.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to hear spoilers, then leave. So the what I was saying is the Fantastic Four are in the Civil War comic, and one of the compelling elements of the story was the fact that Mr. Fantastic and Sue Storm are originally on the same side in the Civil War battle, and then Sue Storm is so convicted by Captain America, she ends up leaving Reed with the kids to go fight on the other side of this war. And I was like, and the scene was she's like saying goodbye to the kids while they're asleep and sneaking out of the house. I was just like, oh my gosh. So like the real human emotional beats are the things that I really enjoyed about that. And that's why this was my first foray into comic
And we're gonna get some
reading.
more into the comics that got you into comics in a minute, but I want to go into my first complete graphic novel. And like Civil War, this is also one where it was originally printed in single issues, but now it's in a graphic novel format. It's Batman: The Long Halloween, and anyone who is a Batman fan and who has any knowledge of comics has probably heard of this title. It is the comic that a lot of the Dark Knight trilogy and the Batman is based off of. But the comic itself is great. It's a very mature comic, and it's about the early days of Batman being Batman. And what it's really about is how Gotham moved away from being a city corrupt by crime bosses and mob bosses, and how those characters were pushed away and gave way to the rogues that we know, the colorful rogues gallery, the Penguin, the Joker. This explains the origins of Two-Face and how he fell from being a force for good, a good district attorney, and became Two-Face. So it's a story about how the traditional realistic mob bosses were pushed away from Gotham, and the actual costume criminals rose up. And it's about that there's somebody called the Holiday Killer, that every time that it's a holiday, starting with Halloween, that's why it's called the Long Halloween, another important figure, a mob boss, dies, and they're trying to figure out who the Holiday Killer is. And it's a really gripping tale. It has a lot of great character development and understanding what the world of Gotham is, and it is definitely probably the most accessible Batman story I would say to anybody. It's not really for kids, but it's really, really interesting to read. I've been trying to get Kelly to read it for a long time, and she
Well,
hasn't yet.
I was just actually reminded of the fact that I haven't read that one yet, and this is again, this is why I need to read more DC because I just haven't read a lot of it. Although I do have several Batman comics and trade paperbacks, mostly given to me by Jacob Berry. Um, who's
Studio Jake.
Studio Jake, who you've also seen on this channel. One thing I wanted to point out about The Long Halloween is that is the basis for the most recent Batman film, I believe. That was
Yeah,
Robert Pattinson
yeah,
Batman,
the Batman.
which I really liked. I know I'm in the minority. I really like that one. But we can talk about that on another time, Kim.
Okay, you have another comic that you have that I know is one of the earlier ones that you read. That's also
Yes.
a Marvel comic.
Yes, also a Marvel comic. Now this one the main reason why I got this was because this is one of the huge bases.
Basis,
I think it's bases, but
bases.
whatever. For WandaVision. So this is House of M, another trade paperback. Teresa's having to teach me all the
The
language.
literacy of comics.
Yes, I'm having to learn all of these the different intricacies and the numbers and the things and the this and the that. But this comic is loosely the basis for the WandaVision series. Now, it deviates in that it's not in set in like a TV show. It's not set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but Wanda is basically a schizophrenic. Like she cannot control her powers whatsoever. Even she's even more erratic than the Wanda that we see in any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe
But I'd like to point out,
versions.
but she's more sympathetic in this version
Yeah.
because they make it clear that she's lost her mind, and she gets a little, like, brief moments of sanity.
She's almost like got a disability,
Yeah, so it's
like
make
a
it
mental
clear, like, I
disability.
remember the part in the book where she talks to Quicksilver about how she thinks that they need to put her down because she's become so
Yeah.
dangerous. It's a brief moment where she's come to herself, but her actions are based on somebody who's completely lost their mind. They're not she doesn't have any control over herself is the point of it.
Yeah, so essentially what she does is she recreates a world in which everybody has like the one thing that they wish that they had solved in life, they have solved. And so for like Scott Summers marries Emma Frost and Peter Parker or like Gwen doesn't die, I
Gwen
think.
doesn't
Yeah,
die.
Gwen doesn't die for Peter Parker, which it's actually kind of bittersweet because then Mary Jane goes on to be this big actress and she still exists, but you know, they never got together because Gwen didn't die, and just all these little things. And I love that it's Wolverine who's the one who, of course, breaks the spell first
Because the one thing
because
he
he's
wanted,
Wolverine.
the one thing he always wanted is to remember everything, and so that because he doesn't know, he doesn't understand his past, his brain is
Yeah.
always healing.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a really great story, and this one also, again, spoilers, has the famous "No more mutants" line at
Yeah.
the end, which is what I was hoping we were going to get something to that effect in WandaVision, and we didn't. So, this, if you guys didn't like WandaVision, you probably will really like this one because this is the authentic, true to the comics version, obviously being the comic version.
Yes. Okay. The next one I want to get into, well, this is sort of me cheating a little bit because one of the best single issues I've ever read is the original version of Batman Mad Love, written by Paul Dini. And the story of this is actually that Paul Dini and Bruce Timm, who were producers and writers and artists, well, Bruce Timm was a producer, Paul Dini was a writer on Batman the Animated Series. They wanted to do, they had a comic that they had to do, and they wanted to do the origin story of Harley Quinn, but they didn't think that they would get it past the censors on the kids, and they eventually did. But they wrote it in comic book form first, and the comic book form is a little bit more violent. It's got a little bit more details about it, but it's multi-award winning comic, and it's really good. And I've talked it about on here before, but the story has been retold so many times that I want to include it with another storyline. And anytime that they go back and they retell this story, they've had so many other writers and artists try to explore it and do a different take on it. Harleen was a very adult take on it, where it made Harley, the original version of her before she went crazy, even though she was always kind of crazy, it made her more of a serious character. Like, she wasn't always cartoonish, she was very serious, and it was really an exploration about how someone lets their mental health break down and how they could fall into
This seems to be a
insanity.
reoccurring theme in
Yes,
comics.
yes, in comics, but it's an excellent exploration of somebody, especially Harleen, of someone falling into insanity. And I'll show some pictures when I edit this. But it's one of the, Harleen is especially one of the best examples of someone using the comic book format to really enhance what they're trying to say. Like, there's a scene in the book where for example, Joker's talking to Harley in their sessions, and it shows Harley in the straitjacket, but Joker's in like this psychiatrist outfit, and it's not really what's happening, but it's symbolic there. And like, there's one with Harley in like the little Red Riding Hood costume, and Joker is a wolf. So there's a lot of visual art in this book. I mean, art is all visual, but there's a lot of art that is enhancing the storytelling. It's not telling you everything that you're supposed to think about the characters. It's showing you it, and it really gives you different layers to it as you're reading it. So that is another graphic novel that I would like to put on my list. And Kelly, I think that your next one is an omnibus.
Yes, my next one is an omnibus. Now, I only recently bought this. Oh, it's so heavy. Oh, omnibus. Oh, this is the most attractive, most beautiful set of comics I have ever purchased. I am so spoiled. I'm looking at the back right now. I'm distracted. But yeah, this is the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas combined, and a lot of the comics that come in between those two. I think it's only missing one section. Um but it's just that I feel like the Dark Phoenix specifically was probably the first classic X-Men story that I ever,
Yeah,
and I'm saying classic X-Men loosely, please don't.
it is classic X-Men.
Okay, I know classic X-Men was actually a run in the
Yeah.
90s, so I don't want somebody to throw me under the bus over saying that. But I love the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, particularly the Dark Phoenix, because the Dark Phoenix I think is more well written. But it also kind of deals with, you know, essentially somebody just giving in to their more evil self. It's almost kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing, because Jean Grey is Jekyll, and Phoenix being Hyde, or excuse me, Dark Phoenix being Hyde. And ultimately, in the original story of Jekyll and Hyde, Mr. Jekyll reveals that he actually is the villain because he would rather be Mr. Hyde than be himself. And it's not that
But
dissimilar.
it has the same ending, the comic book
Yeah,
version, where the good side had to kill the
yeah.
themselves to get rid of the other side.
Yeah. So anyway, ultimately, I really love this story. It's, the art is fantastic, the story is fantastic, and if you really want to know my true opinion, I still think that the X-Men 92 animated version is the best version of the story. But if you want the comic book version, grab this omnibus. It was only $38 on bookoutlet.com. Not sponsored, but I'm telling you, grab this. It was a steal. This is like $100 value at least, and it was on sale for under 40 when I bought it. So grab it, bookoutlet.com.
So I'm gonna cheat a little bit with this. This comic I'm about to show you is not a classic. In fact, I think it flew under the radar because it's very modern and most people aren't reading modern comics. But it was written by somebody. This is an artist, Mark Silvestri, who was working on X-Men comics back in the '90s, and it's a very good Batman comic because it takes all of the characters. It just writes them back to the basics, very accurate to like the Prime Batman comics, Prime Batman the animated series stuff, all of the characters, Batman, Joker, Catwoman, Nightwing, Harley, Joker, they're all in it, but it's about a new villain, and it really it's a very dark comic and very violent, but it really explores like who Batman is at his core and who the characters are at their core, and it gets, there's a lot of comedy in it too, though. It gets like Joker and Harley very right with their dark comedy, and it was just such a refreshing read. It was a really fun read, actually, just to read like classic Batman stories. So like if someone was like, I want to get into Batman, as long as you're not a kid and maybe you can't see the violence in this comic. If someone wanted to understand who the Batman characters are at like their base status quo, then this is the comic to read because it nails all of that perfectly. It's not hard to understand, and it's a pretty quick read, actually. So Batman and Joker Deadly Duo, that is my last graphic novel on it. And now we are going to be moving on and talking about the best single issues of comics that we've read.
I
And
see that we have some overlap, but we
yeah,
don't need to
yeah,
reveal.
not yet, not yet, but in no particular order. So as you can see, Kelly was brought over as this person who wasn't really reading comics, and Marvel brought her over. But recently this year, I've really been able to convert her with X-Men comics and just a lot of great
And
X-Men
by
issues.
I mean, or I want to clarify, like I said, it's really hard to access comics with single issues, and so you really have to, for me anyway, I feel like you have to start with something that's a cohesive story in one book, whether it's longer than a single issue or if you have all the single issues all at once. That helps. But I will pull out. So basically, what we're doing right now is top 5 single issues, and I apologize to everybody. All of mine right now are X-Men. I do have a lot of Star Wars comics that just recently came in the mail that I have not finished, but so far none of them even compare to these selections, and I think we'll probably have to do this video again because I'm sure that a year from now I will not necessarily give all of the same numbers. So we're going to start, for me, the Uncanny X-Men number 179. This one is when Kitty basically sacrifices herself. In a previous issue, she was kidnapped by the Morlocks, and she made a deal to save her life that she would stay with, I forget the name of the character. Who's
Caliban.
Caliban is the one that she, so Caliban's the guy on the front that looks like a nightmare.
You'll
And
see him in the movie Logan if you want to check that out.
yeah, anyway, so she basically makes a deal to save her own life that she will marry Caliban and to save also Colossus's life more particularly. And then she says, "I don't want to marry you. Why should I have to keep that promise?" And then she ends up coming to this point, this kind of crisis of conscience of, well, how can I say that I'm a hero when I'm going back on what I said I would do in order to save somebody's life? And so she goes through with it. She is willing to get married, and then Caliban both saves Colossus's life and releases Kitty from the commitment to have to get married to him as a result of that. So it's a really great comic, and I just really liked kind of the moralizing in Kitty's head of, she is very adamant, I'm not going through with this. I should not have to go through with this, which honestly I agree, but she actually has such character. She says, "I'm not going to go back on my word and break this
Yeah,
promise."
what I
So
really, and Kitty's become one of my favorite comic book characters. What I really
she's so
like
much
about
better
her,
than Jubilee.
yeah, what I really
No
like about
offense.
her, and what I really like about her, and what is really the running theme with the character, especially in the early days, is this child who has to be an adult, have the mind of an adult because of how she's kind of inducted into it and into the X-Men. And Wolverine has a conversation about that with Nightcrawler about how in his day the kids would join the army when they were 12, but Kitty, growing up as a 13-year-old, you see that she has to make a lot of mature decisions even when she's 13, slowly ages out of that, but you really see a strength of her character throughout this time. So I see the comics coming up that we have some crossover opinions on, so I'm going to choose the comics that are different first, and then we can talk about the same issues together. So one of the best single issues I have ever read is Catwoman number 0,
Oh, I
written,
want that one.
and it is drawn by Jim Ballant, and then I can't pronounce the name of the guy who wrote it, Moench, can't pronounce it. Anyway, this is her 90s comic run, and this is one of the best comics I've ever read, period. And it gave me a whole new understanding and appreciating of Catwoman as a character. It goes into who she was as a child and who her mother was, and this independence that she's always had. And it makes a parallel of between her and cats, not as just a silly gimmick, but that cats are aloof and independent, and that they will come to you when they want to. And that describes her entire personality, and we see her throughout her life. Her father was an alcoholic who killed himself. She ran away. She ran away from the police. They tried to force her to be in a girl's home that was an abusive place. She had to escape from there. Somebody, very much like a cat, tried to throw her in the river in a bag, and she still survives. So that whole 9 lives thing. But it explains her agility. It explains so well who she is, and it gave such a depth to the character that you honestly have not seen in any adaptation yet. And I just absolutely love this comic for doing that. It was one of the best reads. Like, if you ever read or watch anything from Catwoman, it should be this comic.
I have, and it's one of the few DC comics I actually have read, and I had forgotten about it, and now you're reminding me that I should have gotten that one with my eBay card.
Oh, well, you can get another time.
Well,
But your next comic?
my next comic, okay, one of my favorite characters, for no reason really, is Rachel Summers. And I was so disappointed in X-Men 97 when who we thought was Jean Grey was pregnant, and she ends up having Nathan and not Rachel. And it was at that point that I knew that that was not Jean Grey, because Jean Grey is not the mother of Nathan Summers. So, but Rachel Summers is the daughter of Jean Grey and Scott Summers, as opposed to Madeline Pryor and Scott Summers. So this comic blew my mind. It's so good. There's two halves to it. The first half is about Rachel, and the second half is about Kitty and Magneto. Don't don't panic. He's not like a dirty old man in this one. X-Men 97 is just it's just I'm just going to go on a tangent for a second. That show ruined Magneto for me, and now I'm having to cleanse my palate with all this good Magneto stuff. But anyway, off my high horse. Um Rachel Summers, also known as Prestige, she basically in this comic, she has come back from the future, Back to the Future style. She was born of Scott and Jean, grew up, did some terrible things as an adult. Basically, as I understand it, she hunted down X-Men like for a living and was paid to do it, and then somehow is thrown back into the past and comes back to find her parents and discovers that Jean Grey is dead and her father has married Madeline Pryor and is pregnant with Nathan Summers. So that sucks.
Tough stuff.
Yeah, tough break, Rachel. And she hasn't told Scott that he's her father, and that's really awkward because she would really like to talk to him, but he thinks she's weird because he doesn't have any idea that there's any relation there. And so she goes to her mom's grave and is just sobbing and crying, and all it's just so emotional and so heartbreaking. And I was just like, this is one of the best comics ever. But wait, it gets better. So the second half is Magneto and Kitty, being the Jewish members of the X-Men, are at a special function at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There are actual drawings of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I've been there twice, and I started panicking. I'm like, they actually made it look like the building, and the inside of the building looks like it was somebody who'd actually been there and probably sat outside and inside and drew what it looks like. And so I was just like, just for the art alone, I was so excited. and even like the placement, because the Holocaust Museum is not far from the Washington Monument, and you could see like the placement of things was accurate to what Washington D.C. looks like. So I was thrilled with that. And then they get into kind of what the whole purpose of the event was, and obviously discussing what happened in the Holocaust, and Magneto's backstory as somebody who actually survived the
And
Holocaust.
this was in the 80s, so it was all natural that they would be alive and that more
Yeah.
survivors would be alive at the time.
Yeah, and so it actually makes sense that this would be, chronologically, that this would make sense. So anyway, and then at the end, there's like an attack in the Holocaust Museum, and Kitty and Colossus have to fight the bad guys, and so on and so forth. And then Magneto ends up giving himself up in the famous scene that they tried to adapt in X-Men 97, because he looks around and sees all of these Holocaust survivors now looking at him as the monster, and he's like, I can't allow this to be my image, and so he allows himself to be
Yeah,
taken
and
in,
I
and then that leads into the trial of
I
Magneto.
want to interject, and we both have the Trial of Magneto that we both got for like $12
And
at
I
an
haven't
antique
read it.
store, and
Yeah,
it's
I have yet to read
a
read it
great
yet.
buy. I just want to interject. That is one of my problems in retrospective of X Men '97 that we've seen it in full is that it tries way too hard to gloss over what Magneto has done. Because in the comics, it's like he sees the monster that he's become
Yes.
with these people who were his people as well as mutants, that now look at him as a monster. In the show, it's constantly making him like pompously grandstand around and be like tell off the people who put him on
It doesn't
trial.
matter. It doesn't matter that I did these bad things, because you guys did bad things too.
Yeah, so anyway, comic book Magneto is so much better. But moving on from Magneto for a second, and I have another Two-Face issue that I want to talk about for a Batman issue. It was so hard to just pick a fifth issue. It could have been any of the so many X-Men issues that I could have chosen, but I wanted to diversify a little bit and put in another Batman. This is another origin of Two-Face, but it is told a little bit differently than the Long Halloween. The Long Halloween is talking mainly in terms of him as a DA, a district attorney, a public figure. This is talking to him more in his personal life and what things happened in his personal life to drive him to be Two-Face. And it is told similarly that there are people that they're trying to prosecute on, and Batman is trying to help him prosecute, but he keeps going off the deep end to another personality, Two-Face. And this deals with him being taken to like an asylum to try to deal with this personality. It deals with how now they made it more mild in like Batman the Animated Series, saying that it was somebody bullied him and so he held in his anger. And this, it reveals he had an abusive father. Pretty much everyone has an abusive father except Batman and Batman comics.
There's a lot of daddy
A lot
issues
of
in this
daddy
comic.
issues, but it reveals he was abused as a child and he pent up that anger, and that is what made the Two-Face personality come out inside of him. And it's a very tragic comic,
It's
but
almost a little reminiscent of how they handled Moon Knight in the show.
yeah. But it's a very dark comic. But like this and Harleen and Mad Love, it kind of shows like there's an Ivy comic I almost used, but these really delve into the psychology of these characters, and like even the Catwoman issue, because the what makes it so interesting is you have these characters with very colorful, insane, almost cartoonish personas, but Batman comics makes you say, okay, look deeper into these characters and what is the crazy psychology behind them and what is the human elements of the characters behind them. So that is why this was another Batman comic on the list to look over. Now, Kelly, we have
Hilariously, I feel like our next three are
are
exactly
all
the
the
same.
same. So let's just do them together. So
Okay.
next on ours are X-Men #4. And since I just talked, Kelly, why don't you explain why this comic? And well, before that, she bought hers, and then she found this for me in an antique store, and it is a comic that a lot of people want to buy, and a lot of people remember. It came out in the '90s with Jim Lee art. Kelly, why is this comic so sought out?
Well, one of the reasons is because it has a famous basketball scene in which Magneto,
Not Magneto.
or excuse me, wow,
No camera.
Gambit, Wolverine, and Rogue and Jubilee are playing basketball, and it's just got some really excellent play and banter between the characters, and Gambit hitting on Rogue, and just over the top stuff. Wolverine yanking Gambit's chain, and all this great stuff.
Diddums Mrs. Shot.
Adams Mrs. Shot. Anyway, all kinds of great stuff. Just it's almost kind of a laid back, fun comic where you get to have some character development in a fun way, but it's not like silly. I mean, it is.
Yeah, I would like to say I think that this comic, the basketball stuff, and then
It's
there.
a good single issue.
Well, what's really great about it is like we're going back and forth because there's a serious stuff happening with like Xavier and Moira,
Yeah.
but then the characters are outside having a basketball game and they're getting mad at Gambit who keeps using his powers, and Gambit supercharges the ball so when it throws it at Rogue and she catches it, it blows her up into the building, which he knows isn't going to hurt her, but Rogue, like there's somebody with PTSD and then Rogue blasts into the building and there's this back and forth and the characters, like there's half the characters are having a very serious conversation, the other half are just in a huge argument over this basketball game, and it's
And
really.
in the center of it all, Gambit grabs Rogue and is like dipping her down, and it's just very it's a bunch of just kind of contrasting scenarios. But overall, I would just say that it's just a fun comic that kind of takes you out of the more serious elements and
Yeah,
gives you that character development
and then
you're
we
looking
and
for.
then we fade into like this date that Gambit's trying to take Rogue on, and the characters are gonna follow him because they see him as a skeevy guy and they
Yeah.
need to defend Rogue. And I think that that really expresses why X-Men comics are so popular and why they became so popular with every demographic. Is in between all the fight scenes and stuff, you got characters doing stuff like going to the mall or playing basketball and in interpersonal drama, and some of it isn't so
It's a soap
serious.
opera.
Yeah, it is a soap opera.
This is
Like
why women gravitate toward the X-Men.
yes, like I'll just give another example. I didn't use this comic as an example here, but there's a comic where it was something like I can't remember exactly what happened, but Rogue had to survive or something, so she kissed Deadpool because he's kind of
Yeah,
unkillable.
yeah, yeah.
And the guy,
That's an
and so there
example.
was a running gag in comics, like everyone was gossiping about it. And did you hear that Rogue kissed Deadpool? And are you gonna tell Gambit? And he said that 11 people called him about it, and he was so upset about it. So but speaking of Gambit, we have another. Now, this might be my favorite single issue of all time, even more than the Catwoman issue. This comic right here. Well, this is an X Men 45, but this is X Men 33, and it is written by Fabian. I can't pronounce his last name. It's something N. But art by Jim Lee. I think it's Jim Lee. Anyway, X-Men 33. And what is so good about this comic is that it explores who Gambit was in his past before he joined the X-Men, before he had his change, what kind of a awful person he was, and trying to contrast that with who he is now. And it's a what's really good about this comic is, first of all, the atmosphere, that it's set in flashbacking to Paris, but it's kind of like this, what they call it is Southern Gothic vibe to it. It's got great art, like lots of dark shading, but it takes you with this guy, this teenage version of Gambit, and what he would do. He manipulates this girl because he wants to steal from her, and it's all a game to him. And she, because of his actions and just treating it as a game, because he's trying to prove himself to the Thieves Guild, she ends up getting killed by Sabretooth, and this is like a big like tragedy. Like he realizes the horrible thing that he's done, and he even brings this up in future comics that he's still never gotten over that has happened. But it explores to you, because Gambit is a character, if you read about him, who has a lot of self-hatred, and that's something that hasn't been explored in like stuff apart from comics, like why he has so much self-hatred, all these bad things that he's done. But this comic really gets into the psychology of his character and who he's been over time, and it also has a lot of stuff with Rogue and how he sees that he's trying to make it work with Rogue to try to redeem himself in part, and how she feels that she can't trust him because of who he was in the past, and she doesn't feel like she can fully trust who he is now. So Kelly read this and said that she thought it was absolutely fantastic. So
Teresa was worried because sometimes our opinions differ. I know this may shock all of you, but sometimes our opinions differ. And Teresa loved this comic and was really nervous about me reading it because she didn't know if I was going to take it one way or the other. And I think again, I agree. This is one of the best single issues I've ever read, and one of the reasons it's because it's a complete story in one issue. It's also a part of a larger story, but you get a complete story within the one issue, and that's one of my qualifications for a great single issue is I need to be satisfied by the end. Even if it's a cliffhanger, I need to be satisfied by the end, and it's really really good. I also just liked how dark they took Gambit, and how um like you said, the self-hatred, it gives an excellent explanation for that. It's not just being, because sometimes people who are insecure or self-loathing are that way because they think too highly of themselves. But this actually gives a good explanation of, oh, he has a good reason to feel bad about himself because he's done some bad things. So that's another thing that I really liked. And then the other thing I liked about it was the whole story is Sabretooth is in jail essentially in the X-Men mansion, and is telling the story in parts to Rogue because he's trying to drive them apart, but she also wants to know why Gambit is the way he is and what she needs to be aware about going forward in their relationship. So that having it be it's Sabretooth telling the story to Rogue and making it personal to Rogue. Just think if you were this girl essentially that he did this thing to, and he you are going to be this girl that he did this thing to and all this stuff. So really great story, really great way of telling the story and communicate. I think the delivery is one of the things that makes the story stand out as much as anything. It's not just the great story, but it's how it was delivered by Sabretooth to Rogue in the context of he's trying to drive a wedge between them. She's trying to fact find to find out, is this guy worth spending time with?
Yeah, and putting her trust in because, comic book Rogue, she feels like she can't trust anybody just to even deal with her situation. And so, of all people, like, she talks about it a lot. She thought that she was just going to be a game to him, just like that girl. But also, I do think it's interesting in the issue that precedes that, issue 28, that the reason why Gambit is so nervous about Rogue delivering the food to Sabretooth is because of that situation that had
Yeah,
happened
he
before.
didn't want her to hear that story. So,
Well, no, he didn't want Sabretooth to attack her.
well,
It's how I interpret that. He
I
didn't
thought
want
he didn't want her to
because
hear the story.
Sabretooth killed that girl. He didn't want Sabretooth to kill her.
Oh,
Okay. Sabretooth kills a lot of people. He's killed a lot of Wolverine love interests, and that's why they have their whole thing.
all right.
Anyway, but we do have another Gambit Rogue issue. X-Men Gold 30. Now, I want Kelly to get into what she likes about it first, and then I want to get into some context about why this was actually a little bit of a controversy when it came out. And, well, I'll explain first before we get into it, actually. Here's what happened, Kelly. Batman and Catwoman were going to get married, and you had to be there because DC was advertising this thing like the second coming. Like, there were like 200 variants. Kelly, they had a website that was like a Batman and Catwoman directory. I remember seeing it, like, what are they doing? What is all this? I have never seen that much advertising for anything ever. This Batman and Catwoman marriage, which was hilarious because at the end of the day, people were like, they're not going to actually have them get married because they're against having Batman ever get married. But then people started to believe, well, they're advertising it really hard. I guess maybe they're actually going to do it. And then the comic turned out to be a bait and switch where Catwoman jilted him at the altar, and everyone was so mad, Kelly. This was like a blow up controversy. I think it was June of 2018 that this happened. But it gave the context of that is Marvel went, DC has this big wedding event. Oh, what do we do? What do we do? Let's have two X-Men characters get married. Let's have it be Kitty and Colossus. And so very rushedly, they had Kitty and Colossus get back together. Kitty proposes. They're going to have a wedding. And everyone was like, what is this stupid wedding? You haven't built this up. You're just trying to shove two characters together so you can have a wedding issue just like DC. But apparently what happened with editorial, they were planning on going through with it, but at the last minute someone was like, maybe we shouldn't have be Kitty and Colossus. What if we do a bait and switch and Gambit and Rogue get married? And which they had just gotten back together in the comics and had patched up their relationship. And so they got them married, and it was like Gambit and Rogue fans were so happy, and everyone else was mad because they're like, you keep ripping us off from these weddings. So now this comic is looked back on as like a special event of, oh, this is the comic where Gambit and Rogue get married. But back then it was like a firestorm because of all of these weddings and false leads. But it is a very it's not a great comic for Kitty and Colossus, but it has fantastic art, and I love how Gambit and Rogue finally get together in this, and how Gambit, in a previous issue was like, oh, I don't think we'll ever get married, but then Storm's speech about it, how he just doesn't want to stay apart from her, and then you kind of see the art and how she's out of focus and then she's in focus. Like, all of that was great. How Gambit is a thief and he stole a wedding, essentially, and how, if these characters were ever going to get married, it was going to be something on the fly, something random like that. So, excellent issue. I really like rereading it. I did not get the cover that I wanted, though. I had to get an alternate cover. I'm still trying to get the cover that I actually want for this comic, and I will eventually. But Gambit and Rogue fans have this issue essentially framed on their walls.
Well, I will just say my thoughts on this comic is I think that the standout, besides the story and all the controversy and everything, is the art. It's got some of the most fantastic art I've seen in any comic, or I should say specifically in any X-Men comic. This is probably some of the best art I've ever seen, and I love the way, as much as people may have at the time been mad about the way Kitty and Colossus were, had their jilting, I thought they made it very unique. Again, spoilers, but you guys have been here this long. There's going to be spoilers. It's very unique because Kitty jilts him by phasing when he goes to put the ring on, and she phases through his hand. And I was just like, that is such a great way to do it, because it actually made it unique and specific to those characters. And then in the next panel, she's so upset and embarrassed, she phases through the floor, and there's this beautiful veil just trickling in the wind left behind, and it was like she disappeared like in a puff of smoke. And it was just amazing the way that they made that moment specific to those characters, and I really appreciated that. And then to Teresa's point, they made the Gambit and Rogue, bait and switch. Obviously that's what fans have always wanted. I had seen art of this before I was really a fan per se. Like I had seen like the 92 cartoon, but that was it. And I had seen art of this and been like, oh, I like, because I'm like a fashion uh junkie, and I'm like, oh, this looks really good. Oh, I'm gonna save this to Pinterest. Oh,
Well, you were already a fan of this characters when it happened. It
yeah,
happened in 2018.
yeah. And I had seen the show. I think I was either watching the show at the time,
You
or
you had
I
watched
had
it
I had
before.
watched it. I was living and working in LA at the time, and I had no life, so that's why I was not a part of all this. But those are my top five, and I think it's funny that just naturally you and I picked three of the same top fives. But
Yeah.
I would like to do this again next year and see if there are any changes. And also, that was a good reminder that I need to pick up that Catwoman comic book.
Yeah, so we've talked for 44 like 42 minutes now. So I think that that is all, but those are all comic book recommendations, what to look for. And I would just say that if you are looking into getting into comics, I would not normally recommend this, but honestly my only way into reading them was to go to read comics online. I am normally against pirating of any kind, but to use the pirate sites where I can preview comics and understand what I'm looking for before I make a purchase
I
has
also
been.
agree with that take, just because with comic books specifically, you could be buying something that you think is completely innocuous, and you open it up and it's straight up porn.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not exaggerating. You could accidentally find something really, really bad. And that's one of the reasons why I agree with Teresa. I'm not for pirating. I try to avoid it, even when it's like on YouTube, like somebody stole a movie and uploaded it to YouTube when they shouldn't have. I try to avoid watching those, but comics, it's kind of like you really need to preview
Yeah,
them
and
before.
like you have to understand like what we were saying before, with like so many stories are just in little pieces building to something bigger. Like for example, to read all the Gambit and Rogue stuff this year, I had to read a reading order and look them all up on Read Comics Online. And like, okay, this part is just a little sequence. This part is a part of a bigger story. This part is a full issue. And I want to get all of them with all the moments, but like you have to read it all together like that. And sometimes it's difficult to find all of that if you just buy them, and you're going to be spending hundreds of dollars to buy them all in back issues now. So you kind of have to do that in order to understand what you want and to understand the full stories. But that is all we've got for now. Thank you, patrons, as always, for supporting this channel. If you want to support the channel, you can sign up to Patreon. Thank you, Kelly, so much for coming on, and we hope that you enjoyed our comic book recommendations, and we will see you guys next time. Wave goodbye.